All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, to thank the Elbam Mishpacha for dedicating all the Shurman Drushos this month in memory of beloved husband and father Jerry Yaakov couple ben Avram Menachem, to thank Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the Shurman Drushos this month in loving memory of Avi Strimber, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi, Zichron Livracha, to thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Moshe and Ellen Gevant, in the merit of Anne Ellen's mother, Nechama Bas Shalom Yitzchok, and Mr. Larry Sufness in memory of his beloved wife Tanya Yona Bas Yaakov. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. Now, boys, with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today, a lot of incredible Gemara. We have to finish up a little bit of Agarata first, and then some really fascinating halacha concerning Karban Pesach. So, boys, today's daf is Samech Zayin 67. 67, thank you. Chavra on Zoom, everybody hears me all right still? Excellent, good. So today's daf is 67. Samech Zayin, we are picking up on Samech Vav Amud Beis 66b, and we are picking up actually with the last of the shortest lines. V'im Navi. So remember again, Reish Lakish was talking about the destructive power of kas. That when a person gets angry, we first started speaking about Gaiva, then Reish Lakish says, if a person gets angry, a person gets consumed by kas, ultimately, again, his wisdom evaporates. If he's a chacham, if he's wise, his wisdom evaporates. And if he's a navi, his nevuah, his prophecy leaves him. So the Gemara gave the example of chachma from Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu gets upset at the Jewish people in the aftermath of the war with Midian. And as a result, it is not Moshe who conveys the halachos of hechsher kelim, the halachos of kashering utensils, but rather it is Elazar HaKohen. So the Gemara understands why wasn't it Moshe? It's because Moshe Rabbeinu got upset. And I both say, obviously that's intuitive. Anger is an all-consuming midah. Right? Anger, when a person gets angry, it blocks out everything else. There's no room for chachma. There's no room for wisdom wherever there is anger. So that's Moshe Rabbeinu. And if he's a prophet and he allows himself to be overrun by the midah of anger, so his prophecy departs from him. Where do we know that from? Elisha. From the Navi Elisha. Then I both say, the Gemara over here is referencing the story in Navi, where the king Yehoram, who was, let's see. Dichsev Lulei Pnei Yehoshaphat Melech Yehuda Aninose Im Abit Elecha V'Im Ereka. So this was talking about an alliance that occurred between Yehoshaphat, the king of Yehuda, with Yehoram, the king of Israel. They united forces in order to fight against Moab and other nations, Edom. So Elisha, when he's referring ultimately to Yehoram, he says literally, were it not for the fact that Yehoshaphat, the king of Yehuda, was here, I would not even look upon your face. So the Navi was so angry at Yehoram. Now I will say, what I want to point out over here is something amazing. This is justifiable anger, meaning Yehoram wasn't a good person. So the Navi is resentful about the fact that there has to be a strategic alliance between Yehuda and Yisrael. And nevertheless, what happens? Uksiv Viato kichuli minagain v'haya kinagina minagain v'atiya alav yad Hashem. And then what happens? Right afterwards, so Elisha says, call for me a musician in order that the Spirit of God will rest upon me. You see this, by the way, Elisha is not the only one who did this. That sometimes when the Nevi'im needed the Spirit of God to rest upon them, they would utilize music. That music was a way, which I will say, now I want to point out, it's not the music, it's the serenity that the music engenders. In order to have a prophetic moment, one must be in a state of inner equilibrium, right? One must be in a state of inner tranquility. That's the Ruach Hashem only rests upon someone who is in a good space. So it's not the pshat that the music brings the Ruach Hashem, but rather the music often puts a person in the state where they're capable of being makabel the Ruach Hashem. But I want to point out over here is that the fact that he needed the musician to put him in a state of tranquility, to invite the Ruach Hashem upon him, the Gemara in a sense indicates to us that Elisha lost his nevuah, at least temporarily. And why did he lose his nevuah? Well, the Gemara attributes it to the fact that he got angry at Yehoram, the king of Israel. Well, I just want to point out over here as well, you see that at least in the case of Yoshua, it's justifiable anger. In other words, it's not anger necessarily irrational anger or unjustifiable anger. What Reish Lakish is pointing out over here is the destructive nature of the midah of kas. Kas, anger itself is destructive, even if it's warranted, right? We saw in Tzidkas HaTzadik, we saw in Tzidkas HaTzadik, in Os Mem Vav, or Os Mem Zayin. We spoke about this idea that even terrible character traits can be used in constructive ways. Is there a constructive use for Kas? Is there a constructive use? Yes. But what is Reish Lakish saying? And this is an incredible musar. Sometimes, even when you use negative traits in a constructive way, there's collateral damage. Others are both said, there are times in life where I have to do something that is difficult. It has to get done, but there is going to be collateral damage. And even though there's going to be collateral damage, it's still the right thing to do. But there is going to be collateral damage. It's an incredible musar, because sometimes we erroneously assume that if you're doing the right thing, everything should just fall into place. Life doesn't work that way. Many times I have to do the right thing, but there's going to be turbulence, and there's going to be damage. There's going to be damage as a result of doing the right thing. It could be that kas may be warranted. There are times where you're supposed to get angry, like you started with tzaddik, right? Even the example of Elisha. But just until whenever you utilize the midah of kas, even if being utilized in the right way, there's going to be some level of damage which occurs. That's the nature of the destructiveness of, it's almost like fire. Right? So there are, if you think about this just a moment, we have to go on. If you think about this, so there are plenty of constructive ways of using fire. But there's one common thing. Whenever you use fire, what's going to happen? Something is destroyed. Right? So you might be burning wood to make a fire in your home or to cook. That's fine. Something will be destroyed. There is no such thing as the use of fire when everything remains intact. It doesn't happen. There is no such thing as, there are times when kas is purposeful and necessary, but it's always going to destroy something. Incredible. So the Gemara goes by, Amar Abaye. Amar Rabbi Mani Bar Patish. Kol shekoes afilu poskan love gidula min Hashem moridin also. We'll say not only that, so Rabbi Mani comes along and says, when a person gets angry, even if it's been ordained from above that they should ascend to greatness, they're brought down. Rabbi will say this is incredible as well, that even if min hashamayim it's been ordained that a person is ola legedula, greatness is in my stars, right? Or not my stars, greatness is in my destiny. If I allow myself to succumb to the midah of kas, then I lose that opportunity. I lose that gedula. And I just want to point. We'll give the example that Amir Hashem will go ahead and explain it. So where do we know this from? Me Eliyav shenemar vayichar af Eliyav b'David vayomer lama zeyarata va'amina tashta ma'at hatzon hahina b'midbar ani yadati es zedoncha ve'esro levavcha ki leman ra'os hamilchama yaradata. Supposed to say, now watch this. So Eliyav was David HaMelech's older brother. So the context over here is, remember, David HaMelech's older brothers were soldiers. And ultimately, again, they go ahead and they are fighting a battle against the Plishtim. David's father sent him with provisions for his older brothers. So what occurs when Eliyav and David, even after he goes ahead and delivers the provisions, is kind of loitering around a little bit. So what happens? Eliyav snaps at his younger brother. He snaps at him and says, "What are you doing here? Why are you loitering around? Who's watching the sheep? I know that you're just here to look for trouble. You're just here because you're a nudnik. You want to see what's going on. Get out of here." So we'll say, so what happens? Now watch how the story plays out. And now remember, fast forward a little bit. God tells Shmuel, one of the sons of Yishai is going to be king. There's only one little piece of information that Hashem leaves out, which is, which son? Yishai had a number of sons. So what happens? So Shmuel goes down to the house of Yishai, and listen to this. He goes through son by son by son. Son by son by son. So what happens? as he goes through each son, so he hears a voice of Hashem that says, Hashem has not chosen this one. Or Shmuel says, Hashem has not chosen this one. Ube Eliav ksiv, vayomer Shem al Shmuel. Yet when it comes to Eliav, so Hashem says a different message. He says, Al tabit al marehu ve'al gava kamaso. Don't look to his appearance, to his stature, ki ma'astihu, because Hashem has decided He does not want this one. Now, interestingly enough, the fact that it says by Eliav, don't look at his marehu, as his countenance or at his stature, indicates to us that, and it doesn't say that about any of the other sons. It indicates to us, Nichlal, the Havarachim le ad ha'idna, that we can infer from that Eliav was in the running. He was in the running. To the fact that his countenance and his stature were so noticeable indicates, as we know that the king has to be handsome, and the king has to be tall, and the king has to hold himself, has to conduct himself in a certain way. So the fact that Eliav is described this way indicates us that he was in the running. So why did he lose out any possibility of being the king? Because he was angry. Because he succumbed to kas. Now, I just want to point something out. Remember, the Gemara is giving an example of how many times did Eliav get upset? How many times did he get angry? Once. Now, maybe he got angry more than once. Just like maybe Elisha got angry. So I just want to point out all of these examples of people getting angry. Like Moshe Rabbeinu, okay, maybe Moshe Rabbeinu gets angry twice. Right? Maybe. Once by Midian, once by the Selah. Maybe, right? Maybe we're talking about on a hand, Elisha, how many times? Eliav, how many times? But also, what you begin to see, and especially this last piece over here, Raimani's saying that if a person is meant for greatness, but they succumb to the midah of kas, that greatness is removed for them. Why? Because to accomplish great things in life, I must be an even-keeled person. When a person succumbs to kas, what they are showing, what they are highlighting is they do not possess full, complete emotional stability. And if you want to accomplish great things in life, Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to give you the reins of greatness, there must be emotional stability. Without emotional stability, it's very hard to get traction. Because without emotional stability, you don't necessarily have a lot of the things that you, and I don't mean emotion, I don't mean that a person who gets angry is emotionally unstable in a clinical sense. I'm talking about over here just why Chazal is so hyper-focused on anger. And ultimately, again, what Rabbi Mani is saying is, even if HaKadosh Baruch Hu ordained that you're going to be great, but you succumb to anger, they take away the greatness. Because if there's not a sense of stability, if there's not a certain sense of being even-keeled, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I can't rely on you to execute great things. Incredible. So both let's go weiter. Ashkechon, Tamidu Pesach, the Dachu Shabbos, the Dachu Tumuna. So now we're going to begin a very interesting discussion. I understand that, that's funny. Actually, when I look at this, there's a delay on this, right? I got very nervous there for just a moment. I thought I was living in a parallel universe. Yeah, okay, good. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, we've now found, Ashkechan Tamidu Pesach, the Dachu Shabbos, the Dachu Tumuna. So we'll say we've established already in yesterday's daf that both Tamid and Pesach are Docha Shabbos. So that we've established. Now, but from where do we know that they're Docha Tumah? So we'll say we're going to get into this Tumah discussion, but don't worry, it's one of the good Tumah discussions, right? How do I know that Karban Pesach and Karban Tamid are Docha Shabbos? Docha Tumah. Amri, ki heichid yolef Pesach mi Tamid le'inyan Shabbos, ha'chinami yolef Tamid mi Pesach le'inyan Tumah. To which the Gemara answers the same way that we learn out Pesach from Tamid. That just as Tamid is Docha Shabbos, so too Pesach is Docha Shabbos. So we'll make an opposite limud. We'll learn out Tamid from Pesach le'inyan Tumah. And just like Pesach is Docha Tumah, so too Tamid is Docha Tumah. Very nice. But Pesach gufe minalan. But again, where do I know Pesach itself? From where do I know that Pesach is Docha Tumah? Rabbi Yochanan do Amar Kra ish kiet Tamid lenefesh. Because we'll say when the Torah speaks about Karban Pesach, Pesach Sheni, and the ability, if for some reason you are Tameh, and you were unable to offer up by Pesach Rishon, you could go ahead and offer up a Karban Pesach by the makeup date a month later. So the lashon that it uses is ish, if a person will be Tameh, to which the Gemara darshans, ish nidcha le Pesach Sheni, an individual could be delayed to Pesach Sheni, ve'ein tzibur nidchen lePesach Sheni. But the tzibur, which means also the congregation of Israel, Klal Yisrael, cannot be delayed to Pesach Sheni, ella of the betuma. But rather, if you have a situation where halacha l'maisa, 51% or more of the Jewish people are tamei, they offer Pesach Rishon in a state of tumah. So we'll say a very interesting limud. By Pesach Sheni, the pasuk says, ish, individuals are pushed off to Pesach Sheni, but the tzibur is never pushed off to Pesach Sheni. If more than 51%, the majority of Klal Yisrael are tamei, so then they offer up the carbon Pesach bituma on Pesach Rishon. Elav bituma. Amar le Rishon Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Ema ish nidche le Pesach Sheni. Tzibur les leitakant lo Pesach Rishon Pesach Sheni. Well, maybe it means something else. I'll agree with your drush of ish. That only individuals could be deferred to Pesach Sheni, but maybe if the tzibur is tamei, maybe the tzibur has no recourse. Maybe the tzibur, if they're tamei, can't offer up on Pesach Rishon or Pesach Sheni. Amar Rav Shimon Lakish, rather Reish Lakish gave a different source. How do I know that Pesach is docha tuma? Nihacha v'ishalchu min hamachaneh kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lanefesh. Both sides, the pasuk says over here that they will send away, right? Tzavis b'nei Yisrael v'yishalchu min hamachaneh. Command the Jewish people and tell them to send away every tzarua tzaraas. Zov, an individual suffered an emission. V'chol tamei lanefesh. Tamei lanefesh, both sides means tumas meis. Anyone who has exposure to corpse tuma. So Yomar Tamei Meisim Val Yomar Zavim Mitzoran. So we'll say this is the halach of Shiluach Min HaMachana. Now we're going to get into this in just a little bit, and it's actually quite fascinating. Different forms of tuma require different, I'll call it, levels of exile. So in other words, every time you're tamei, you have to leave something. How far out you have to go, how far your exile extends, ultimately depends on the level of tumah. So here the Torah is telling me that if somebody is a metzora, a zav, or tamei meis, tamei lenefesh, corpse tumah, you have to leave the machane, you have to leave the camp. Now what that means, which camp, we're going to talk about in just a moment. So the Gemara says, Yomer tamei meis, Yomer zav metzorain. So let the Torah just tell me that the concept of shiluach applies to tamei meisim, and there's no need to say zavin and metzorain. Why, Rabbosai? If you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, Zavinu Mitzran, last Rashi, Chamur mitmei mesim, shahari tuma yotzale migufam. So I want to point out something very interesting, which is we're going to see now, not all forms of tuma are created the same. Now we already know this. But interestingly enough, when you put these three together, tumas meis is going to be the most lenient. Above that, next lenient is zav. And then the most severe will be Metzora. Again, we'll fill in a couple of other forms of Tum in that as well. So the Gemara says, all the Pasuk needs to tell me is that somebody who's Tamei Meis needs to be sent away from the camp. And I would say, once someone who's Tamei Meis has to be sent away, then certainly what? Zavin and Mitzoran have to be sent away as well. Vani Omer im Tamei Meis im Mishtach and Zav Mitzoran l'kosh again. And I would say that Allah Chalamaisa, if a Tamei Meis has to be sent out of the camp, then certainly Zavin and Mitzoran have to be sent out as well. Top of Samech Zayin, says the Gemara, Eli yesh l'cha sha'a shezavin and Mitzoran mishtalchin, ve'in tmei meisim mishtalchin. So it's a fascinating drasha, says Reish Lakish. Rather, what is the pasuk teaching me? That there is a time where Zavin and Mitzoran will be sent out, but those who are tmei meisim will not. We'll say, when is that? Ve'eza ze Pesach haba b'tumah. We'll say that'll be a Pesach where 51% of Klal Yisrael are tamei, tumas meis. They don't have to leave. They could offer up the carbon Pesach, but yet those who are zavin and mitzorain still have to leave. So we'll say, so Reish Lakish. So remember, everybody's agreeing with the core principle, which is that Pesach is dochet tumah. They're all agreeing with that. The shaila right now is, where do you learn that out from? But what I do want to point out is something very interesting over here. That Reish Lakish is the first one who is explicitly saying that the concept that the tzibur could offer up Pesach in a state of tumah is only tumas meis. It's only tumas meis. So, for example, if the majority of Klal Yisrael were to become zavin or mitzorain, there's no offering up Pesach in that context, right? It's only tumas meis. We'll see that further clarified in just a moment. Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, well, Reish Lakish, if you're right, ihachi leima nami yomar zav utmei meisim val yomar metzora. If that's the case, the pasuk could have just mentioned zav and Tamei Mesim, by the halach of Shiluach min hamach, and sending away from the camp, and you don't have to say Mitzorah. Vani Omer, and I'll say as follows, Zav mishtaleach Mitzorah l'kol shekein. If a Zav is sent out from the camp because of his tumah, then it goes without saying that a Mitzorah should be sent out. Eli yishlecha sha'ah shemitzora'im mishtalchin ve'in zavinu tmei mesim mishtalchin. And I could have said there's a time where Mitzora'im are sent out, but maybe Zavin and Tmei Mesim are not. And when would be that time that Zavin and Tmei Mesim don't have to leave the camp if they're Tamei? Ve'eza, ze Pesach haba b'tumah. This refers to Pesach, where Claudius was in a state of Tumah. So we'll say Abai counters back, and he says, maybe, according to you, the exclusion for communal Tumah is not just about Tumas Meis, but could also be about Zav as well. Not Saras, because as we're going to see in just a moment, Saras is a more severe form of Tumah, but maybe the exemption for communal Tumah should be both Zav as well as Tumas Meis. So maybe you'll say, that's a good chap. You're right, maybe that is the case. It's not true. I'll tell you why. Vatnan, Pesach haba b'tumah, lo yochlu mimenu zavim v'zavos, nidos v'yoldos. And I'm both saying explicit Mishnah. And what does the Mishnah say? That when you have a situation of Klal Yisrael, 51% of Klal Yisrael are Tamei Tumas Meis, we offer up the Karban Pesach in a state of communal Tumah. But even then, there's an important halacha. Individuals, Zavim, Zavos, Nidos, Yoldos, women who gave birth, are not permitted to partake of the Karban Pesach. I'm going to say, the halacha, I just want to point out, just as an aside, there's another machlokes that we will deal with, which will have ramifications on this as well, which is the notion of tumah hutra b'tzibur, tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Right? What happens when 51% of Klal Yisrael is tamei tumas meis? Is it that the laws of tumah are just fundamentally suspended, they don't exist? Or that, no, they exist, but essentially we allow people to transgress. So we'll discuss that. But in any event, the Gemara says quite explicitly that license to consume Karban Pesach in a state of Tumah is very specifically reserved for Tumas Meis, not for other forms of Tumah. Amar Abaye, rather Abaye says, I prefer to go back to what I said before, or to what was said before. Amar Abaye, the Olam Mikra Kama. Rather Abaye says, I believe that we have to go ahead and learn it out from the original pasuk, which Abosai was what? Remember, that was the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan, who said, Ish. When the pasuk speaks about Pesach Sheni, so what did the pasuk say? Individuals. If an individual was tamei and was unable to perform Pesach Rishon, he's permitted to go ahead and perform Pesach Sheni. So to which Rabbi Yochanan you see from here that only individuals are deferred to Pesach Sheni. The collective is never deferred. So if the collective as being defined by the majority, becomes tamei, they offer up the Pesach in a state of tumah. Allah Amra Abaye, the older Mikra Kama. Imkein nichtov rachmana ish ki yihiyeh tamei. So we'll say if that's the case, ultimately the pasuk could just say if an individual be tamei, lenefesh lamali. But we'll say why do I need the word lenefesh? Right, to both say, remember again, I have this, the pasuk in its entirety is Dabral b'nei Yisrael lemor ish ki yeh tamei lanefesh al b'derech rechoka. So why doesn't it just say ish ki yeh tamei? Why do I need lanefesh? Lanefesh lamali v'chi tema hay lanefesh lahachi hu da'asa hatamei meis hu dinit chala pesach sheni aval shar tamin lo. So Rish Gemara says, well, there's an obvious answer to that because of what we were just talking about. See, Rabbi said, if it would have just said ish ki yeh tamei, well, I don't know what. What don't I know? What type of tumah? What are you talking about? So ish ki tamei lanefesh. We'll say tamei lanefesh refers to very specific tumah, corpse tumah, and it's coming to teach me that it's only dafka tumas meis in which the congregation is able to offer up to Karban Pesach in a state of tumah, but other forms of tumah. You cannot go ahead and offer up the Karban Pesach in that state. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, before we get to that, the context of the pasuk. No, maybe the pasuk is teaching me like this. Who is deferred to Pesach Sheni? Perhaps it's only someone who became Tamei through Tumas Meis. Aval Shar Tamei and Lo. But maybe people who become Tamei with other forms of Tumah, are not deferred to Karban Pesach. But that's not true. Vatanya, we learned, Yachalo Yehe Osin Pesach Sheni Ela Timei Mesim. So ultimately, again, one might have thought that the only people who could avail themselves of Pesach Sheni are people who contract corpse tumah. The Gemara says, V'shahaya b'derech rechoka, or someone who is too far away, because that's explicitly mentioned in the pasuk. Zavinu mitzora'im uba'alei nidos minayin. So we'll say, remember again, interestingly enough, the ability or the opportunity for Pesach Sheni is given to anyone who was tamei, irrespective of the source of your tumah. So even if a person was a zav or a mitzora, bali needless also means a man who had relations with a woman who was a nida, and therefore by definition contracts some level of tumah as well. Minayin. So how do you know that these individuals, if they were tamei at the time of Pesach Rishon, have the ability to utilize Pesach Sheni? Talmud Lomar ish lenefesh. Therefore, the pasuk. Ish. Therefore, the pasuk says ish. So we'll say, here's what's interesting about the drasha. So the way the Gemara is actually in the pasuk is like this: ish tells me that what? Tells me that what? There are any form of tumah, right? Ish kiyeh tameh, which means any time that you were tameh on Pesach Rishon, irrespective of the type of tumah you had, whatever type of tumah you had, that tumah precluded you from offering Pesach Rishon. You have the ability to avail yourself of Pesach Sheni, but still. Lenefesh de kasev rachmana lamali. Why do I need lenefesh? As Rabbi say again, if you're telling me that you could avail yourself of Pesach Sheni if you were tummy during Pesach Rishon, no matter what type of tumah you had, why do you need lenefesh? As Rabbi say, what's the modifier there? What's the lenefesh? Remember, when I see tummy lenefesh, I automatically assume what does that refer to? Corpse tumah. That's tumas meis. But you're telling me now, so what does that mean? Only someone who was tummy tumas meis by Pesach Rishon has the right to avail themselves of Pesach Sheni. That's not true. That's not true. We're seeing that explicitly. That's not true. No matter what your source of tumah, if you are unable to offer a Pesach Rishon, you could offer a Pesach Sheni. In fact, that's what's being learned from the words ish. If that's the case, what's the nefesh therefore? So the Gemara says, Elahachi kamar. Ish nidchel Pesach Sheni, vein tzibur nidchel Pesach Sheni, ela avdi bituma. Rather, I will say the way you have to darshan the pasuk is like this: Ish comes to teach me, as we originally said, that what only individuals are deferred to Pesach Sheni. But if for some reason the congregation Klal Yisrael is tamei, remember the majority, 51% of Klal Yisrael is tamei. What's the halacha? They don't do Karban Pesach Sheni. Instead, they offer a Pesach Rishon in a state of tumah. The tzin tzibur nitchel Pesach Sheni ela avdi betumah. Avdi tzibur betumah betamei meis. But I will say when the tzibur goes ahead and performs Pesach Rishon in a state of tumah, that is only if 51% of the tzibur is tamei with tumas meis. Aval shar tumas lo avdi. But if they are affected by other forms of tumah, that will not allow them to offer up the Pesach Rishon in a state of tumah. So we'll say, the way the Gemara is dashing in the pasuk is actually really quite fascinating. So it's ish kiyeh tameh lenefesh. So we'll say, which is teaching me as follows. Ish, first part of the drasha, teaches me that only individuals ultimately again are deferred to Pesach Sheni, not the tzibur. And therefore, if 51% of the tzibur ultimately is tamei, they offer a Pesach Rishon in a state of tumah. But what type of tumah? So then remember how the pasuk flows. Ish kiyeh tamei. So that tamei, of course, teaches me that from an individual level, if you are tamei, ultimately you have the ability to avail yourself of Pesach Sheni. But then what does lenefesh teach me? Lenefesh actually doesn't teach me about Pesach Sheni. What does lenefesh teach me about? Pesach Rishon. And it's going back actually on the ish. And it's going back and it's telling me that when we say that the tzibur is not deferred to Pesach Sheni, because the tzibur could offer up Pesach Rishon in a state of communal tumah, that's only one very specific situation of tumah, which is lenefesh tumas meis. So 51% of Klal Yisrael is tamei tumas meis, then halacha l'maaseh they offer up Pesach Rishon in a state of tumah. But Rabbi say, just to understand, if a person is tamei, they're permitted to go and offer up Pesach Sheni. What type of tumah allows you to offer up on Pesach Sheni? What type? Anything. Remember, on the Yachid level, any type of tumah, which would preclude you from offering up Pesach Rishon, ultimately again allows you to offer up Pesach Sheni. So we'll say a dramatic limud. So Amar Rav Chisda, Mitzvah Shenich. So we'll say, so we've pretty much ironed that out, right? So halacha l'maisa, we'll say here are the facts we have. Number one, if 51% of Klal Yisrael is Tameh, we go ahead and we offer up Pesach Rishon in a state of Tumah. Because Pesach Sheni is only designed for Yechidim, not designed for the collective. What type of Tumah, what type of communal Tumah could we offer up Pesach Rishon in? Only Tumas Meis. However, in Pesach Sheni, which is made for the individual, no matter what type of tumah one contracted, which then prevented one from going ahead and offering up Pesach Rishon, ultimately, again, you could go ahead and offer up Pesach Sheni. So whether Tumas Meis, Zav, Mitzvah, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. So we'll say now, we're going to go back and focus a little bit more on this concept of Shiluach. So remember, the Pasuk taught us before that we saw that if you're Tameh, you are sent out of the camp. We're going to qualify that a little bit. If a Metzora went in, lifnim memichitzaso. So I'll say literally again, inside of the boundary. He was expelled from the boundary, but he went inside of the boundary. And I will say, we're going to see in just a little bit, the Metzora is expelled from the city. He must live outside of the confines of the city. So the Gemara says, what happens if halacha l'maisa, he goes in, he enters into the city, pater, ultimately again, he doesn't receive malchus, which means he's in violation, but not in violation of a prohibition. Shneimar, badad yeshev michutz lamachane moshavo, hakasav nisko la'aseh. So we'll say essentially, a Masorah is expelled, but if he violates his quarantine, right? If he violates his quarantine and he enters into the city, he doesn't get malchus. Why not? Because actually he's in violation of a positive commandment, not of a prohibition. Okay. Eisvei, Metzora shenichnas lifnim memichizaso. A Metzora violates his quarantine and he comes inside of the city. Remember again, the Metzora, his expulsion is from habitation. See, he has to live outside of the city. So if the Metzora violates his quarantine, he comes inside of the city. Ba'arboim, he gets 40 malchus. 40 malchus. So, right, 40 malchus. Zavin v'zavo shenichnasu lifnim memichitzas and arbain. Similarly, again, a zav and a zava, ultimately who come within their boundaries, right? They violate their quarantine. They also get malchus. V'tamei meis, and tamei meis mutter likanes lemachane levia. We'll say someone who's tamei tumas meis, ultimately again could come into machane levia. So let's talk about this in just a moment. So the Metzora is expelled from the city, right? That's the Metzora. If you look at Rashi, zav, it's the last short line in Rashi, Zav, Michitzaso harabayis, the Asr likanes b'machane levia. We'll say a Zav, so really the Metzora is expelled even from what we call machane. So I remember again, we kind of take this model from the Midbar. It's easy to visualize in the Midbar, right? In the desert, in the middle of the desert encampment, what did you have? You had the Mishkan, Machane Shechina. Around the Mishkan, you had Machane Levia, the Levitic camp, and then around Machane Levia, you had Machane Yisrael, the rest of the tribes. So if you can imagine that model for just a moment. So interestingly enough, the Metzora is expelled from Machane Yisrael. So if you can just imagine the visual right now, right? So the Metzora is expelled from all habitation, right? The Zav, we're going out of order here a little bit. The Zav is not permitted ultimately again in Machane Shechina. So the Zav, Machane Levia. So the Zav is not permitted to go ahead and go into Machane Levia. And ultimately again, the Tamei Meis is not permitted to go into Machane Shechina. So let me reverse the order a little bit. Tumas Meis, as I mentioned before, is the most lenient form of Tumah. You understand? I don't literally mean that, but when talking about Tumas Meis, Zav and Metzora, Tumas Meis is the most lenient one. So, for example, Tumas Meis, the halacha is not permitted to go ahead and enter into Machane Levia. Right? I'm sorry, I keep saying this wrong. Tumas Meis is not permitted to enter into Machane Shechina. So Tumas Meis could go up to Machane Levia. Alright, after that, ultimately again, I have Zav. Zav is not permitted to enter into Machane Levia. One step down. And Metzora has to exist outside of Machane Yisrael. So we'll say, in a Beis HaMikdash perspective, just to give you an idea about this, so, for example, somebody who's Tamei Tumas Meis is permitted to go onto Harabayis. They just cannot enter into the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. Well, so this is actually incredibly important because this is part of the discussion about going up on Har HaBayis today. And even though, again, we are all Tamei Tumas Meis, there are, according to many opinions, areas on the Har HaBayis where one is permitted to walk around, even if a person is in a state of Tumas Meis. You're not permitted to enter into the confines of what is or what are the boundaries of the Beis HaMikdash, but on the periphery of Har HaBayis, one would be permitted to go, even if one was Tamei Tumas Meis. Okay, so Rabbi says, so just keep this in mind right now. So Tumas Meis can go into Machane Shechina, but ultimately, again, could enter into Machane Levia. So Zav can't enter into Machane Levia. Mitzora expelled from Machane Yisrael. So the Gemara says, "V'lo tamei meis bilvad amru ela afilu meis atzmo." Both say, by the way, this is very interesting. Not only could someone who's tamei tumas meis go into Machane Levia and Har HaBayis, but even a corpse itself could be brought up on Har HaBayis. Shnei Marabel say, where do we see this from? That a corpse is permitted to be a Machane Levia. Get ready for this. So the Gemara says, Shenemar vayikach Moshes asmos Yosef imo b'mechitzaso. They both say, because watch this. Who took the remains of Yosef? Moshe. Where did Moshe live? Moshe lived in Machane Levia. So you see from here that halacha l'maisa, even a corpse itself is permitted to go ahead and come into Machane Levia. Pretty amazing. So the Gemara says, Tanahi, in reality this is a machlokes on this sanya badad yeshev, levado yeshev. So the pasuk says that the Metzora is supposed to sit badad. What is badad? Levado, by himself. Why does it have to say that? Shelo yutemein acherim yoshvin imo. Because it will say, you might have thought that, you know what, let's go ahead and let's start the Tuma community, right? A Tuma breakaway minion, right? We'll go ahead, we'll have all the Zavin, Mitzora'in, everybody could be there together. No, the Metzora Rabbo says not only did an expulsion, but it's a din in isolation. So Bada Yeshev the Metzora must be alone. Because you might have thought, we'll say that Zavin and ultimately Tomei Mesim are sent out. Literally, Mishtalch means that their expulsion is the same. Talmud Lomar, V'lo yitamu es machanehem. Therefore, the pasuk says they shall not defile their camp. Litein machane lazeh u'machane lazeh divrei Yehuda. We'll say, so the fact that it says their camps indicate to us that there's, just like the Metzora separate, there's a camp for Zavin, and there's a camp for Tumei Mesim as well. Rabbi Shimon will say, so again, highlighting this idea that although Tumas Meis, Zav, and Metzora are all subject to Shiluach, to expulsion, their expulsion is different, right? For Tumas Meis, the expulsion is from Machane Shechina, from Zav, it's from Machane Levia, and for the Metzora, it's from Machane Yisrael. So the Gemara says, there is Rabbi Shimon Omer, Eino Tzarech. Rabbi Shimon says, you don't need this whole drasha. So the Gemara says, Harehu Omer, Vaishalchu min ha-machana, kol tzura v'chol zav v'chol tamei l'nefesh. The pasuk says, they shall send away from the camp, every tzarua, every zav, and every tamei l'nefesh. Yomar tamei meisa, yomar tamei zav. The pasuk could just say tumas meis, you don't have to bring in zav. Why? Va'ani Omer, tamei meisim mishtalchin, zav and lo kol shekein. Both say, remember again, zav is more chamer than tumas meis. So therefore, let the Torah just say that somebody who's tamei tumas meis is subject to shidduch, subject to expulsion. And if tumas meis is subject to expulsion, all the more so zav, lama ne'amar zav, litin lamachane shnia, excuse me, both say to tell you that the expulsion of zav is different than the expulsion of tumas meis. That where someone who's tamei tumas meis is expelled ultimately from machane shchina, someone who's a zav is also expelled from machane levia. V'yomar zav al yom mitzvah. Fine. So let it just say zav, and it doesn't have to say mitzvah. V'ani omer zavin mishtachnu mitzvah lo kol shekein. That if a zav is expelled, all the more so a mitzvah is expelled. Lama ne'amar mitzvah litei machane shlishis kishu omer badad yeshe bakasav niskol la'aseh. Both say to teach me that even though a zav is subject to expulsion, and then certainly a Metzora is subject to expulsion, that the Metzora's expulsion is more severe than the zav. Whereas the zav is expelled ultimately again from Machane Levia, the Mitzorah has a greater intensity. He is expelled from Machane Yisrael, the general Jewish encampment. And I will say, but remember, as we said before, but if a Mitzorah violates his quarantine or violates his expulsion and comes back in to Machane Yisrael, there are no Malkus. There's no Malkus, but rather, again, he's simply in violation of an Asay. So the Gemara says, "My chumrah de Zav mitame meis." We'll say, why is Zav considered to be more chamer than tumas meis? Shekein tuma yotze alav migufo. Because I will say, as opposed to tumas meis, which is a tuma that is visited upon me from external sources, Zav is an emission, which means the tuma comes from within. Adarabba, tumas meis chamer shekein ton hazash lishu shvi. I could say just the opposite. I could say tumas meis is definitely more chamer. Why? Because it requires sprinkling with the waters of Paraduman days 3 and 7, whereas Zav does not require that. So the Gemara says, Amrikra, Tame, V'chol Tame l'Rabos. Therefore the pasuk says Tame. The pasuk that the Gemara is referring to over here, we'll say, is the pasuk of Shiluach. So the Gemara says, V'chol Tame l'Rabos, Tame Sheretz. V'zav, so the Gemara says, V'chol Tame l'Rabos, Tame Sheretz. And I will say, included in this obligation of Shiluach is also going to be Tumas Sheretz. Rashi says, Rabbi Tame Sheretz, the Shiluach v'odin rogem menavela. Essentially, we're going to see that any type of Tumah may result in some form of Shiluach. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, "V'zav chamer mitame sheretz," and zav is definitely going to be more chamer than tumas sheretz. The Gemara says, "My chumri kidar minan." Why is zav more chamer than sheretz? So as we just said before, sheretz is an external tumah, zav is an internally generated tumah. Adarabba, sheretz chamer shekem mitame ba'ones. Well, I could say that sheretz is more chamer. Why? Well, this is actually very interesting. In general, we say that a zav, a person only becomes tummy from a zav emission if it's not ba'onis. Now, we'll say ba'onis in this context mean as a result of some type of external stimulus. So, for example, let's say a person becomes afraid, or the Gemara says they jump, and as a result, ultimately, again, they experience this type of emission that doesn't generate tumah. See, interestingly enough, tumas sheretz is even ba'onis, even outside circumstances against your will, but tumas zav does not generate that type of tumah. Ki agavna. So the Gemara says, zav nami tumuye mitame ba'onis. No, not necessarily. Ultimately, again, zav, Rashi points out, by re'iyah rishona. Zav could even become tameh as a result of external stimuli. Kid Rav Huna, Dram Rav Huna, re'iyah rishona shazav and tameh ba'onis. Fine. Sefer will say, because again, according to the opinion of Rav Huna, because Rav Huna holds that Allah Chalamayz that the re'iyah rishona, remember again, the first emission by a zav could potentially even create tameh ba'onis. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, my chumri di mitzorah mizav. So we'll say, why? So now remember, we're creating a hierarchy, right? And in our hierarchy, if we go from least severe to most severe, least severe to masmeis, again, I will say, I want to qualify that. You know that there are forms of tumah that are even less severe than tumah sheretz, tumah savela. But in the major three, if we go from least to most, least severe to most severe, we've got tumas meis, zav, mitzorah. Tumas meis, zav, mitzorah. We've already explained why zav is more chamer ultimately than tumas meis. Because tumas meis is generated externally, whereas zav is generated internally. Fine. I will say, continuing, my chomer de mitzorah mizav. Why is mitzorah considered to be more chamer than zav? Shekim tar priya uprima. Because I will say, by mitzorah, what's the halacha? The mitzorah has to allow his clothing, or first has to allow his hair to grow. He doesn't cut his hair, he allows his hair to grow wildly, and he tears his clothing. And ultimately he is forbidden in marital relations. So I will say these are strictures that apply to mitzorah that do not apply to zav. Adarabba, I can say just the opposite. Zav chamer, shekem metame mishkav moshav. Zav could be more chamer. Why I will say? Because it's tamei mishkav moshav. I will say, remember again, what's mishkav moshav? If a zav sits on top of something, anything that supports the weight of a zav ultimately becomes tamei, even if the zav is not directly touching it. So also remember again, the classic case of this is, imagine you have a pile of 10 cushions. The zav sits on the top one, so obviously again, he's coming in direct contact with the top cushion, but all of the bottom 9 cushions are tameim as well. So zav has this mishkav moshav. Furthermore, again, kli cheres behesit. Furthermore, again, if a zav directly moves, even if he doesn't touch a kli cheres, he conveys tumah to the kli cheres. So I will say, those are pretty significant forms of tumah that apply to a zav that do not apply in other contexts. Amr kra, zav v'chol zav l'rabos valkeri. To which the Gemara says, interestingly enough, so the Gemara is pointing out that each of them have their own chumros. The Gemara says, it could have just said zav. Why does it say v'chol zav? V'chol comes to include another form of tumah. What's the other form of tumah? Both say bal keri, a man who experiences a seminal emission. U'mitzora chamar mi bal keri, and a mitzora is considered to be more chamar than a bal keri. Why is that? Umay chumrei kida amra. Both say that's as we said before, because ultimately again, the mitzora has priya uprima, right? The mitzora has to allow his hair to grow, he has to tear his clothing. Therefore, again, that's more chamer than balkari. The Gemara says, adrabah, balkari chamer. I could say that balkari is more chamer. Why? Shekin metami b'mashu. Because what's very interesting, when it comes to tumas keri, even any amount of a seminal emission is enough to go ahead. In other words, any amount of zera that comes out is enough to go ahead and render an individual tamei. So the Gemara says, "Sarvala Rab Nasan, Da'am Rab Nasan, Omer Mishum Rabbi Shmuel, Zov Tzarich Kechasimas Pia Ama." The Rabbi say here you have Rabbi Nasan says in Rabbi Shmuel that Allah Lamaisa, a Zov only becomes tamei if there is enough of an emission to cover the opening of the makom milah, the area from where the emission occurs. So the Gemara says, furthermore, v'lo hodu lo chachamim, and ultimately, but the chacham disagreed. Ve'iskish lei balkari lezav, and balkari is compared to zav. So at least according to this particular opinion, the same way that the same way that the zav requires a shear, requires a certain amount of emission in order to become tamei, that same halach or that same shear will apply by balkari as well. So the Gemara says, "V'chol tzarua lamali." So why does the pasuk have to say v'chol tzarua? Why doesn't it just say tzarua? Why v'chol tzarua? Aidi dichsiv kol zav ksiv nami kol tzarua. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says it's just textual symmetry. The same way that it says kol tzarua, ultimately again it's kol zav as well. Rabbi Huda Shaper come Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, according to Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Shimon's saying good, right? Rabbi Shimon's his retort is good. You know, you require that phrase for something else. The Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yachol Doch goes Zavan Mitzvah V'Nichnasu Lazar B'Pesach Haba B'Tumah Yachol Yuchei. Rabbi said, listen to this incredible case. What happens if you have? So remember, what did we establish on Amud Aleph? We established on Amud Aleph that Allah Lamaisa, the concept that the tzibor is permitted to go ahead and offer up Karban Pesach in a state of Tumah applies to who? Or applies to what? Tumas Meis. And Tumas Meis only. It does not apply to other forms of Tumas. Well, imagine the following scene. What happens if Halacha L'maisa 51% of Klal Yisrael is Tameh? 51% is Tameh. Ultimately, they're offering up Karban Pesach in a state of Tumah. And Rabbi say, who bursts through the door? The Zavin, the Mitzora'in, and they come into Machane Levia. They come into the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. So Yachlu Yuchayav, and you might have thought that they would be chayiv. Ultimately, again, for violating their expulsion, for violating their quarantine. So the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, V'yishalchu min ha'machane kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lenefesh. Therefore, the pasuk says, "You shall send out of the camp any tzarua, any zav, and anyone who has tumas meis, tamei lenefesh." Both say this is incredible. B'shashet mei meis mishtalchin. At a time when those who have tumas meis are sent out of the camp, zavin umitzora in mishtalchin. Then zavin and mitzora are sent out as well. Ein tzimei meis mishtalchin. But if there is no obligation of shiluach, ultimately again by tumas meis, then what? Then ein zavin umitzora mishtalchin. Then Zavin and Mitzrayim are sent out as us. We'll say, this is a mind-blowing limud, an absolutely mind-blowing limud. So I want to be clear. What the Gemara is suggesting over here is, the concept of shiluach, of expulsion, is an all-or-nothing halacha. See, either everyone is subject to expulsion, or no one is subject to expulsion. So therefore you have this very unique situation, where you have 51% of Klal Yisrael in a state of Tumas Meis, which means you could offer up Karban Pesach in a state of Torah. And as we said before, who's permitted to eat the Karban and offer up the Karban under those circumstances? Who? Only those who have contracted Tumas Meis. So only they could eat it. But yet the Gemara says, if the Zavar and Mitzrayim were to enter into the Beis HaMikdash, although they are not permitted to partake of the Karban, they would not be in violation of Shiluach. They would not be in violation of the tenets of their expulsion, because again, since in that situation now, those who are Tamei Tumas Meis are not subject to expulsion, because ultimately 51% are already Tamei Tumas Meis, those other groups are not subject to expulsion as well. Both an incredible Gemara. Right, we'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up a little bit more with this in Mir Hashem tomorrow.